This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder, and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. My guest on the podcast today is Chris Betts from Transient, Artisan Ales in Bridgman, Michigan. Thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Cool. We're going to talk about all sorts of beers that Chris makes, everything from hazy IPAs and pale ales to barrel-aged beers, big stouts, pastry stouts. Probably going to jump in a little bit and talk about some of the spontaneous beers that they brew. But first, nearly 2,000 breweries across the U.S., Canada, and Mexico partner with G&D Chillers. Innovative modular designs and no proprietary parts propel G&D ahead as the premier choice for your glycol chilling needs. Breweries you recognize, Russian River, Ninkasi, Jack's Abbey, Samuel Adams, and more, trust G&D to chill the beer you love. Call G&D Chillers to discuss your project today or reach out directly at gdchillers.com. And Old Orchard supplies craft juice blends from the heart of Beer City, USA. As the industry's blending experts, they supply major national brands and growing breweries alike. They've been the best-kept juicy secret in craft beverage for years, but now the secret's out. Breweries across the board are experiencing a seamless transition to Old Orchard as their new juice supplier. So hop aboard the Old Orchard fruit train. Their sample kit starter pack is waiting for you at www.oldorchard.com/brewer. They're up there in Michigan, just like you, Chris.
Oh, yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about your arc through brewing, how you got interested in it, and in a quick sense, what that arc looked like to get you where you are today, having launched your own brewery, Transient Artisan Ales, and been operating that brewery for the last few years.
Okay. I'll give you just kind of a little bullet point kind of thing. So I started home brewing in college, sophomore year. Made some terrible beer, stopped for a little bit and then picked it up, got more serious about it, was brewing every weekend. And that was about the time I started working for Two Brothers Brewing.
Oh, cool.
I was a bartender and server there. Right. After a little bit, I moved on to Jolly Pumpkin to bartend there and finally got a job brewing at Witch's Hat in Michigan. So brewed there for about 6 months, got a job opportunity back in Illinois, moved home, worked for One Trick Pony for about a year, and all under the idea that I would open my own brewery there, kind of as a gypsy brewer.
Sure.
Rent space from them, have my own tanks, and produce my own product. So that would be about 6 years ago now.
Right.
So I operated it as a gypsy brewer for about 2.5 years to 3 years, somewhere around there,
Sure.
before opening up my tap room in Michigan. Jumped around, gypsy brewed at a few other locations, Hailstorm and Aquanaut.
Yeah.
And then opened the tap room 3 years ago now. And in Bridgman, Michigan, southwest corner of the state, right on Lake Michigan. Originally, I had been traveling back and forth between South Line, which is on the east side of the state, back to Illinois, kind of every weekend, and really kind of fell in love with Southwest Michigan. It's the fruit capital of the Midwest. That's where I was able to get my first group of barrels from, wine barrels. And
Yeah.
it just seemed like the best place to put a wild-focused brewery. If we're going to look for the best potential atmosphere for a spontaneous brewery, it seemed like the fruit capital of the Midwest would be it.
So that was the goal then. The idea with Transient was to, and I guess the name even kind of speaks to that idea, that to build a brewery that was focused on spontaneous fermentation.
Yeah, make something kind of that was unique every batch, that we have our amount of control over in our process, and there's still a bit left to change every single time. And we don't necessarily want to put out the same product every time. We want to put out a good product every time.
Yeah.
But we're fine with it changing over the course of its lifespan, each batch, and that each particular beer to continue to change and develop, through natural fermentation and re-fermentation in the bottle and aging.
And I know, we've got some pictures of this in Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine from a Breakout Brewer story that we did, I think, a couple of years ago. So anyone who's a subscriber can just dig in and get some of the visuals to go along with that. Talk to me a little bit about your spontaneous process. How you envision it, how it might differ from other kind of methods. For spontaneous, mashing and wort creation, and then. I know you've got a kind of interesting cool ship program up there. What does that look like for you? Describe it to everybody.
So our first couple batches, we did almost everything traditional, turbid mash, and obviously everything is cool ship inoculated overnight.
Right.
At temperatures where it doesn't get below freezing and doesn't really get above 40 for the entire night. Usually brewed at the end of fall and the start of spring. With like a little bit of gap when it gets too cold to do a spontaneous beer.
Because you are in Michigan and it gets pretty damn cold up there.
Yes, it does. This year's been kind of weird in general because it's been mostly too warm to brew them.
Interesting.
In the months that usually it would be too cold to do it. Our process started as being very traditional, and we moved away from the turbid mashing because we were not seeing any benefit to it.
Okay.
And it was breaking a lot of our mash paddles. Turbid mashing it's a real pain in the butt. And since we weren't seeing any real benefit aside from it being, traditional, we moved away from that to just doing a higher mash temperature. So we're mashing in, instead of, a standard mash being at about 150 degrees Fahrenheit, we're at, 160 on up, 165, something that produces a lot of starch instead of converting all the sugars. So then, all the wild yeast and bacteria have something to chew on over a longer period of time.
Right.
So we use aged hops still. We do everything else still very traditional. Rack into the cool ship overnight. Rack out when the beer is below about 75 degrees Fahrenheit, but usually above like 65. Into oak barrels. The first year, we went right into the barrels without going into like a holding tank to mix it, to homogenize everything. Because everything kind of gets stratified in that wort overnight. So you have, our first year, we had just barrels that were real funky, and then we had another barrel that would be really sour, and then one that would be really kind of neutral from the same batch.
Yeah.
So from the second year on, we started homogenizing them in a tank or just gently stirring the cool ship before transferring into barrels. And we saw after that we were getting more uniform. Each batch was kind of the same. Barrels would have a little variation, but
that's what makes blending fun, though, right?
Yeah, and we would still we would still be able to blend between these barrels and between different vintages and different batches, but we didn't have a single batch that would have one beer that is just completely bland and flavorless, and another one that's, way more sour, and one that's way more funky that you really have to put a lot more, thought into, like how they're going to blend out. So that was the biggest change that we've made to the spontaneous production. We do about 10 batches a year, and each one fills 4 wine barrels or 2 puncheons. We have moved towards puncheons, which are 132 gallons instead of the 60-gallon barrels. And we've found that those age a little bit gentler. We don't have as many like overly sour barrels. They have a little bit less oxygen ingress, and that kind of allows the lactic acid bacteria to produce less acid. Or the acetic acid bacteria that could potentially, which we don't want that. But there's a little bit in several of them.
Yeah. That's not, in limited amounts, not the worst thing in the world.
No. It can be helpful even. It can round out a beer properly.
Have you done any studying of what ends up in this culture? Obviously, you're looking at this kind of wild, spontaneous, what's in the air, what's around you kind of culture. But one of the obvious challenges with any kind of beer like this is, making the beer that the environment's going to make for you is one thing. Making beer that people want to drink is a whole nother thing. And hopefully those two things align. That becomes the big kind of challenge for spontaneous beer makers. How do you find that nexus of those two things? So, for you, are there other environmental factors that you've been able to kind of massage to help the way that these things express to come out either more consistently or to bring out other flavors through that process that you find favorable in the beer.
The biggest things that we've kind of adjusted for that end was the homogenizing, the move to the puncheons. Those were really big, and also our hopping rate. We're using aged hops, so it's kind of a crapshoot. You don't know what the alpha acid actually is, and based on who you talk to or what you read, the hopping rate for a lambic style beer is pretty vast. So at first we were trying
the range of hopping rates. Sure,
we were experimenting between like a quarter of a pound per barrel.
Yeah.
Like 60-minute addition up to like 2 to 3 pounds per barrel, and we were getting just a variety. The ones that had way more hops had less acidity, and that favored the Saccharomyces and the Brettanomyces that were landing in the beer, inoculating overnight. The ones that had less hopping had more lactic acid activity, and we kind of adjusted that to we're right now around like a half to 3/4 of a pound per barrel. So those two things, the adjustment with homogenizing and the adjustment with the hops, have kind of given us a more uniform product. It did mean that some of our first year batches, we did 10 that year, so we had 40 barrels. I think we ended up dumping about 10 of those because they were either one direction or the other. They were either bland and flavorless and had really no wild character, or they were just too far down the sour line or unpleasant in one way, and we didn't want to even worry about trying to blend them out with anything else.
How much variation throughout a brewing season does time have for you? If you're doing multiple batches or 10 batches a year, how much variation is there from batch to batch based on whatever might be happening in that specific night or that that week for that matter? And how impactful is that on on the beer that you end up making from those?
I would say as long as we're hitting those temperatures properly and brewing on the days that are best or what we kind of know to be best. It's I don't think that is necessarily what is translating to like differentiation between all these batches or barrels.
Okay.
Because we haven't. I know some other great breweries have done a much warmer inoculation or even a much colder one.
Sure.
That's not something we've really experimented with. We've kind of stuck to the small range that we have heard and kind of experienced works well for those beers. And I would say we get more variation just on their own than on the batch to batch based on temperature, because we're always trying to brew during those same time periods that have the same kind of temperature.
It does get very cold in Michigan. Do you temperature control these barrels as they're going through the aging process? Do you allow some fluctuation? What is your philosophy around that kind of thing?
So the barrel side of our building for the spontaneous beer, it is temperature controlled, but not to a great extent. I think we sent the thermostat to it's set to like 82 or 84 in the summer, and I think we set to like 60, maybe high 50s in the winter. And I think that might, the swelling of the barrels over that temperature change is doing something. It's
sure.
pushing liquid into and out of that oak. And that's something that we want to see. We don't want, fully temperature controlled barrels. I think that wouldn't necessarily show the spontaneous, culture properly.
Yeah.
But then again, it's still so much up in the air that we're controlling such a small amount that we hope it's doing something beneficial, but there's no real way for us to know based on what we have in front of us.
Yeah. Does that, as I'm trying to think about that, I would assume that there's a different fermentation dynamic to what you might be brewing in the fall season versus what you're brewing in the spring season, just because, that fall season.
Fall season will go through the cold.
It's going to go through the cold.
Before
right.
Yeah.
Do you see that? I mean, how does that reflect for you guys?
I would say our batches year to year will have variation, but I wouldn't say it is all that, fall, spring. I wouldn't separate barrels or batches that way.
Right.
I think the variations happening in other ways, different styles of barrels that we're filling, and the different things we're doing with our process that we've changed over those first. We're now in our 4th year of spontaneous production, so those first 3 years we were altering parts of our process. So I think now that we're working into a point where we know our process and our hopping rate and what kind of barrels we're filling and the time of month and the temperature that we're filling them at, I think now we'll be able to see maybe more from other factors like that.
When you say the barrels that you're filling, are you just talking about the difference between puncheons and smaller barrels, or are you using different types of wine barrels or puncheons, or is there some variety there in the barrel sourcing?
We've done both the wine puncheons and standard wine casks, and some spent spirit barrels as well. Actually, for the festival tomorrow, we have an absinthe barrel aged spontaneous beer that we're bringing out. We have done a couple in bourbon barrels.
I should probably reference that. We are up here in Breckenridge, Colorado for the Big Beers, Belgians, and Barley Wines Festival.
That's the one that it'll be released for, and that'll be released in our tap room eventually. We do fill some spirit barrels. We have some gin barrels filled right now. We filled some bourbon barrels with not the greatest results. Okay. They were already used for a stout, and then they were steamed and cleaned to hopefully take away any potential Saccharomyces that's from those stouts, but they didn't turn out great. They still had a lot of bourbon character, and they developed a lot of color from the char in the barrel, and they just didn't taste right. That was a good bit of 1 year's production that we ended up dumping. That was about 8. It was 2 full batches, so like 8 bourbon barrals that.
It's a tough learning process.
Yeah, it is. There. And it's like, well, we have these barrels. Why not try them again? Because we have used bourbon barrels before, secondary use for like a sour red ale.
Yeah.
Where some bourbon character is nice and it's complementary. Sure. But for something a little more delicate like a spontaneous beer, it did not work out as we hoped.
Talk to me a little bit about blending. How much of a role does blending play in your spontaneous beer program?
Definitely for the first couple of years where we were not doing the homogenization and we had to blend between some pretty different types of beer, and we were blending a product that we have never worked with before. Up to that point, we were only doing pitched sours that we knew what was in them. It would normally come out kind of how we expected, and often it was only blended between similar beers and similar barrels, not between different vintages and different batches. So it was kind of a learning curve just from the blending standpoint, something that I had never done before. So it took a lot to kind of get used to it and try to put out something that's similar batch to batch, but not necessarily the same, which is, I think, very difficult to do.
Sure.
And the people that do it so well, that's like Cantillon and all the other great lambic producers. That's why they're great, because they can take a bunch of different products and put out something that's pretty similar. Or like Jolly Pumpkin, that will put out all these different sour beers that are blended between many barrels, and like La Roja tastes like La Roja almost every time you have it. And that's a testament to how good they are at just blending. That's something we're still learning. It takes a long time.
Talk to me about that learning process. I mean, what does that learning process look like for you?
It's sampling a lot of beers that don't do everything on their own, and you're just trying to figure out what they're missing. And
what are the mechanics though? And this is always something that's fascinating to me. I mean, are you pulling out percentages or pulling out samples of each and then testing how varying percentages of each thing may reflect or bring things out? Most of the time these flavors don't work in linear fashions. It's not like if I just had 10% more of this, it's just going to do this. It doesn't ever work that way. It's like, you go from 10% of this in the blend to 20%. It's like, oh, this sucks now. It's not like I just got a little bit more of what I wanted. It just took it to a whole different direction. Talk to me a little bit about that, understanding the way that certain characters in these blends, some elements of these might have outsized influences that, completely destroy this linear idea of how these things might work.
So I would say the biggest influence on and kind of restraint that we have with such a small program. I mean, I think it is a lot of our space that's taking up, and it's our heart, but it is a small program. We're only filling 40 barrels a year. The difficult part is that you can't really, or in our size, you can't really do like a partial barrel. Otherwise, you have to dump the rest of that barrel somewhere. You can't just leave all the headspace from what you just emptied out. So we're looking to make a blend that is, this barrel, that barrel.
Right.
And you need to make it work from full barrel stock.
Right.
Unless you're going to just pull off some as a straight barrel blend, which we've done in very small amounts, like fill like a keg and just do that's just this.
Sure.
Otherwise, we're just working full barrels, and our batches aren't that big. So normally it's between a 2 and a 5 wine barrel blend, or like 1 punch and 2 wine barrels, something around that volume. So we're really kind of restricted by making a blend that makes sense and is somewhat similar to other batches that we've done with that restraint.
Yeah. I want to switch gears, and obviously spontaneous is a big part of what you do, but it's probably not the bulk volume of the beer that people buy from you. And so let's talk a little bit about hazy IPAs and then some of your kind of pastry stout approach. Before we do that, the founders launched SS Brewtech with a very clear goal to advance brewing equipment design, performance, and quality to the very highest standards in the industry. With a team that draws upon strong functional backgrounds in brewing science, mechanical engineering, industrial design, supply chain, and manufacturing, SS Brewtech has the people and skill sets you'd want and expect from your supplier of pro brewing equipment. Head over to ssbrewtech.com for more information on their brew houses and brewing gear. Also, did you know that breweries that serve food see an increase in revenue of 1.8x? Second Kitchen is a food tech startup that connects local breweries to iconic neighborhood restaurants to help provide your brewery with food experiences that keep customers in your taproom longer. Second Kitchen provides the technology, support, custom menus, and more, all at no cost to your brewery. So let's talk a little bit about Hazy IPA, Chris. I know it can. Some people look at it as the thing you have to make in order to sell beer out of a brewery and support the things you love. But I get the feeling that you actually do enjoy making those beers too, and have a point of view to what you do. There's definitely a dryness, in addition to that kind of juicy character that I've sensed out of the beers that I taste, from you. Talk to me a little bit about as you think about building a house character around these kind of juicy and hazy beers, how you think about those things, and then how, from there, how you've made some, recipe decisions and process decisions in order to kind of support this idea of how you want those flavors to express.
Yeah. So we started brewing some hazy IPAs and pale ales pretty early on, well before the tap room. We started brewing them for our beer release events. So we would do this bottle membership event release that was every like 3 to 6 months. It'd be all sour beers, the occasional imperial stout, but otherwise all sour beers on tap. And then we'd make like one batch of IPA that I would make as like a 15-gallon batch for people that kind of like have a palate refresher. And that beer was always based on the IPAs I really loved, still today and at the time, which was kind of like the Hill Farmstead and Alchemist style, which is both juicy and hazy, but more dry and like refreshing. Something that you'd want to drink several of. So when we were first making these hazy IPAs, that was the goal. We wanted something that was that direction and not necessarily the other direction that a lot of other breweries have taken it, which is a little bit sweeter, and big, juicy, fruity flavors. Now, I love the juicy flavor, but I also want something that finishes pretty crisp kind of at the end. And early on, we were doing a lot more heavier carbonation and doing lower finishing gravities, but still with the same hop usage. Still just packing it with dry hop and late addition hops. So we first started making Obligatory. That was kind of our original IPA. and then slowly started adding some others when we added our tap room, and then started canning, and it kind of took over like half of our production pretty quick.
Yeah, careful what you wish for.
Yeah. But we knew all along when we ended up opening a tap room that would be a necessity.
Sure.
Before we had the tap room, we didn't have any tanks that really would work for making an IPA. We didn't have any temperature controlled tanks, and we didn't really have the need to do that. Right? We were making just saisons, which was our focus. And then with the tap room, well, just like with the beer release events, you can't just have saisons and sours, because even the people that love those need a break every once in a while, or else they're just going to leave and go to the next place. Correct. So we started with obligatory and added juices loose, and then we were kind of selling out faster than we could produce them, and that just evolved into us canning, and that turned into us having several more clean fermenters than originally planned.
Yeah. Talk to me a little bit about, both malt and hop selection in that as well. And I'd love to, kind of talk about what you shoot for gravity wise on these beers.
Yeah. So, the original one, obligatory, the idea was that we just want to use what is my favorite malt, Golden Promise.
Okay.
It's just an excellent, European malt. It's a little bit darker, Lovabond than most of what's used in the juicy beers nowadays that really use a lot of Pilsner. And then we slowly worked in Pilsner and beers like Cromulent and Juices Loose, especially the ones that are getting a little bit higher in ABV, to keep them not tasting like too big or too malty.
Okay.
We still wanted to finish crisp. So, we started adding Pilsner malt. And other than that, you just round it out.
Those bigger beers, what does that look like in terms of Pilsner malt to Golden Promise?
On Juices Loose, it's about 50-50 for those two bases. And all of our beers kind of work in oats and wheat.
Right.
And we took the approach early on that it was a lot like how we make our saisons, where they all have usually just a base malt or two.
Yeah.
And then they have other grains that kind of would accentuate where we want to go with it. Most all of our saisons have oat and wheat as well in different quantities. Some have rye, depending on what we want to pull out from that beer. So we approach the hazy beers the same way. Every single one of them has oats. Nearly every single one of them has wheat.
Oats and wheat. Go for both of those things.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. And they both have their benefits to both styles.
Sure. Are there some specific oats and wheats that you really enjoy using?
We use a lot of torrefied wheat.
Okay.
In both our saisons and our hazy IPAs. We have used quite a bit of flaked wheat as well, and then we use a lot of golden naked oats.
Yeah.
As well as malted oats and flaked oats. And depending on the beer, sometimes we go one direction or the other.
Yeah.
Golden naked oats are kind of one of my favorites out of any malt, but flaked oats give a little bit better body, and they don't add as much sweetness.
I love that there's this commonality between your kind of malt approach to both your saisons and your IPAs, and that they have all of that kind of in common with each other.
Yeah, and it kind of, in my mind, you're pretty much just making a canvas that both those hazy IPAs and saisons have a lot of character coming from the yeast.
Right.
So the other things that you're doing is pretty much just building your mouthfeel or any other thing like your head retention.
Yeah.
And that's what we're looking for in the malt. It's not necessarily looking for over the top character. We're not using a lot of like crystal or anything that's going to add like sweetness or any other fruit flavor in that direction. We're trying to just start with like a canvas that the yeast and in the hazy IPA, the hops, they can do the real work, but it has a good starting point, to go from.
Yeast wise on the hazy IPAs, are you open to talking about what you use?
Yeah. So early on, right when we started, we were just culturing up yeast from cans of Heady Topper. So that would be the Conan yeast.
Right.
When we started brewing like commercial batches, that wasn't as feasible because all the generations we'd have to go through to build up that yeast would change it considerably. So by the time we had enough to do a commercial batch, it wouldn't taste necessarily the same, especially for our method for yeast propagation, which is not, as good as like a lab.
Sure.
Obviously. When we started doing commercial batches, we did a mix of London 3, which is probably what you'd expect from Hill Farmstead and Tired Hands. They use London 3, and now a lot of breweries use it.
Sure.
It's a very reliable English yeast. And we would mix in Conan as well. At about a 3-to-1 ratio, London 3 to Conan.
Why go through that trouble?
I didn't think either on their own were as good as when they were mixed.
Okay.
When we would do just Conan on its own for commercial batches, we were getting some inconsistency with finishing gravity. When we started adding in the London 3, we were very consistent without losing any like real character. And in fact, I thought the aroma and flavor was even better.
Yeah.
And we knew where it would finish at if we did everything else right. If we hit our temperature in the mash right, and hit our gravities right, we would have the proper finishing gravity. Whereas when we were just using just Conan, still up in the air, and it could vary like 2 to 4 gravity points, which isn't huge, but it's something.
Yeah,
it's a half a percentage alcohol, and that ends up being either sweetness or dryness, at a direction away from what we want. Recently, we've been doing just London 3. And we kind of bounce back and forth. And now just London 3 has been perfect. It finishes where we want it. It finishes dry still. If we have a beer that we aren't looking for, that dryness, we can just add non-fermentable sugars, whether it be maltodextrin or lactose.
The old lactose trick, yeah.
When we do either of those, we do them in pretty small quantities, somewhere around 15 to 20 pounds for 15 barrels. So very small, just to add like a point to 2 points if we expect it to finish drier than we're wanting.
What is your goal for that kind of end gravity? What is that gravity that you want people to taste in the can?
For instance, like Cromulent, which is my favorite pale ale we make. Probably the pale ale that we make more than anything else, with juice being like the double IPA we make more than anything else. Cromulent, we want to finish between 10.08 and 10.10, so 2 to 2.5 Plato. Juice is loose. We expect that to finish at about 10.14. It has finished up to 10.18, but normally 10.14 to 10.16, so fairly dry for the style.
I mean, not dry for Saison, but dry for Hazy IPAs. Very significantly dry. How, aiming for that kind of dryness has other impacts on flavor. Certainly has an impact on the way that people perceive that kind of fruitiness and the hops character. How do you balance that? Are you dry hopping at a larger degree in order to kind of cover for that, or do you simply enjoy the kind of drier approach, and that kind of more subtle hoppiness or fruitiness? So
I prefer the dryness. We still push for the big dry hop. We still do 2 large dry hop additions and a very substantial double Whirlpool and hop stand addition. So we're still hopping at the rate of most of the other East Coast style producers.
Yeah. It sounds like a little more hot side and Whirlpool than
we do. We on some of our beers we'll do like a 15-minute addition as well to give it a little bit more flavor and a little bit of bitterness, which I also prefer, just like a touch of bitterness in my IPAs. But the fact that it finishes a little bit drier, for me is the goal. And I know that that's not necessarily common taste. A lot of people that want the juicy IPA want a sweet beer. It's just not necessarily what I want out of it. So we're fine kind of being the different one in the group, at least in the Midwest. I know there's a few people that brew similar styles, obviously.
Sure.
The ones that we kind of modeled ourselves after from the beginning still make very dry, drinkable, hazy beers. But we're not necessarily trying to chase a specific style that's being demanded currently. We want to make our version of the style, and we want it to kind of be unique-ish.
how in general, do your customers, respond to that? How's that feedback look? Now, and it's such an interesting thing when you look at beer on a national kind of scale. These cans that you release may end up, shipped to trading partners all the way across the country.
Yeah.
Their context is different. They may not understand, you have a different brand approach to how you make these kinds of things, but at the same time, like, none of us in the world of brewing who are really involved and have our livelihood staked here really want to see an entire world of brewing where everyone's trying to make the same thing. Like, that is incredibly dull. It's not interesting at all for anyone if everyone is simply trying to make the same, hazy IPA with the same level of sweetness and the same hops. I mean, that would be thoroughly boring.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, from your standpoint, how do you, both identify and create this, and explain this approach? Also, flip side, as we start seeing people being more conscious about sweetness and then the way that they consume it, we're also watching, all trends are cyclical, all flavor, all palate thing, these all move in different directions. We are, I think, in some degree ways starting to see people start to seek out drier beers again, in small ways, but how does this impact, how you sell beer and how you think about beer and how you find the customers that are right for the beer that you want to make?
Yeah, so I would say one of the biggest things I've noticed in the last 3 years since we started kind of packaging and releasing these beers, and even the 6 years from when we started brewing, just like those test batch kind of things that we were putting out at releases, there's definitely been like a creep in sweetness demand or tolerance. I don't know what you would say.
Sure.
So initially they were about on par with like the West Coast styles for sweetness.
Yeah.
But they were different in a lot of other ways.
Sure.
They were still a lot rounder and bolder with like that hop juiciness. And then as the years have gone by and people expect it to be a lot sweeter, that's kind of had there's been a little bit of pushback, and people just expect every hazy IPA that they drink that tastes like a cup of juice.
Right.
So when we produce these beers and then market them and sell them, we're not trying to, build the expectation that that's what they're going to get. We try to still use the words that we think define our beer. Like, we still may say like, this is juicy, but we will also say it's crisp and like refreshing.
Yeah.
As we think this beer should be. So when we want to, seek out our customers, we hope that they're looking at, the product and not just, it's a hazy IPA. It's got to be just like this other hazy IPA in any character that we're looking for. Ours are going to be a little bit different in those regards.
How does that influence, your hops choice? Does it influence it at all? Or, do you also have, your own likes and dislikes around those kinds of things?
Yeah, I have my own preferences on hops for sure. I've been the one thing I've really been trying to work in a lot more on our juicy beers, hazy IPAs, are some of these really fantastic local hops that we have they're varietals that have been around for ever for the craft beer scene in the U.S., like Cascade and Chinook, but they're being produced by growers that are putting out a product that's completely different. If you were to smell them side by side with like West Coast produced Chinook, it's a different hop. It does not smell or taste anything alike.
I think you're right. I mean, years ago, I remember drinking a New Holland IPA of some sort that was brewed with Michigan Cascades, and like the strawberry notes in there were like, where did this? This is not Cascade that I'm familiar with. Yeah. The terroir and the growing conditions made for a completely different flavor expression in that kind of hop. That certainly keeps things interesting. Talk to me a little bit about those Michigan hops and some of the varieties that you really enjoy.
So there are a couple. My favorite is Michigan Cascade, but Michigan Chinook is equally impressive and probably further from regular Chinook. So Michigan Chinook is really pineapple-y, where like the West Coast, Northwest Chinook is more resiny and dank.
Right.
It's got a little bit of that, but it's more towards like the fruity pineapple side. And everybody, all the other brewers that I kind of have tried to introduce this to have just fallen in love with it. And they're like, I didn't know a Chinook could smell and taste like that. But it's still kind of strange because people have that perception when I say, oh, we're releasing a beer that has Citra and Chinook. And they're like, well, you lost me at the second half of that. If you just kept the Citra, that'd been great. But we're trying to, educate the consumer in this regard that, these are unique to us and they're special and they're not going to taste like what you're thinking when you think of Chinook. So Cascade Chinook, Cashmere is another one from Michigan that's just excellent. And there's a couple others. Michigan Copper is really nice, and there's a few others that they're developing. And then they even have some old world varietals, some noble varietals like Saaz that are just unique and fantastic themselves. That we work into like our lagers and other beers that would otherwise use continental European hops. But we want to use something we still love, like German Hallertau, Mittelfrüh, and the classic hops you use in a lager. But when we want to work in something kind of different and unique that still has some sort of ties to the European varietals that would traditionally be in that style, like our Helles that's dry hopped, we have Mittelfrüh and Michigan Cascade, and we've also used Laurel, which is a new German hop. But just working in different things that kind of just a little bit different to the market for those styles.
Yeah. Using these kinds of, fruity or more flavorful, hops and these kind of styles certainly brings its own challenges when you're brewing across these things. How do you envision and still kind of maintain an expectation for some of these more traditional styles, but at the same time kind of, approach that kind of a more expansive flavor opportunity?
So when we do our like more traditional styles like saisons and lagers, with the saisons, that's always kind of just been an open page. Like you can do whatever you want, really. There are a lot of traditional hops that you could use in them, but they do very well with anything like Galaxy or that was one of the first saison we ever produced was a Galaxy saison, dry hopped with Galaxy as well. When it comes to lagers, that's something we're still learning a bit.
Sure.
That's another one that has a pretty long learning curve.
Yep.
And we're just trying to produce something that's good. And so
sure. So something you want to drink, something you're proud of to call your product.
And I like fell in love with Helles last time I went to Munich, and I've been kind of obsessing over making both a traditional one and then this dry hopped one that uses some local hops, because for them, they're using their local hops. We should have something that's kind of unique, and it may not be a traditional German Helles, but it is German Helles inspired. But we're trying to use our products to make something that's maybe not the same, but equally proud of our own product.
At some point, we'll have to, discover a language to describe these things that may, change the expectations around that, because, certainly Helles has its own expectation coming, from that tradition. And, but at the same time, American brewers brewing lagers, whether it's Highland Park or you all or anyway, lots of creative expressions, resident culture for that matter, since you're wearing the hoodie right now. Looking at these kinds of, creative lager expressions, they are equally valid to, the kind of highly attentive, quote unquote, authentic. I hate using that word because I don't know that it really means that much, given that there's such a variety of things to be modeled after off of those original things. But having said that, there is room for creating these interesting expressions that both feel like those beers, but feel like something that is also American and creative and our own at the same time. Yeah.
If I was just looking to make a clone of another beer, I could easily do that, but we want to put our own little take on it and still enjoy it as much as I enjoyed like that Augustiner Helles I had. That blew my mind having that, fresh. Now I want to make something similar and give that experience to somebody else that comes in my tap room, even though it doesn't taste potentially like theirs. It could be unique and beautiful in its own way.
Yeah. So, Chris, tell me what does success look like for you and for Transient Artisan Ales? When will you know that you've achieved it? Maybe you already have. But what does that look like? What's the goal? What's the when will you know?
We've the kind of joke every time we do like a little expansion, it's I always say it's like, this is the last one, and every time it hasn't been the last one. But I'm trying to eventually, hopefully now, just kind of this is the last one. I can just enjoy that we are making a good product. People are enjoying it and buying it, and we don't have any debt or any. That is success for me. That we have staff that are happy, well cared for, putting out a good product. They care about the product, and that's it. And we can hopefully just settle down for a minute, and I can catch my breath and just appreciate the bit of success that we've had. I think that would be success for me, being able to appreciate where we're at right now.
That makes sense. Nearly 2,000 breweries across the U.S., Canada, and Mexico partner with G&D Chillers. Old Orchard supplies craft juice blends from the heart of Beer City, USA. SS Brewtech has the people and skill sets you expect from your supplier of pro brewing equipment. And Second Kitchen connects local breweries and iconic neighborhood restaurants to keep customers in your taproom longer. Chris, if people want to learn more about Transient Artisan Ales, where do they find you?
So our website is a great source of information, transientartisanales.com. It has our tap list and hours, and our to-go menu as well. Our Facebook page is updated almost every day with, any events that we have coming up. And they can always reach out to us at transientartisanales@gmail.com. We get back to them as soon as we're able. We're a small team of about 5 people, so it's not always that moment, but we do our best to respond to questions and concerns.
Well, all the best to you in continuing to pump out flavorful, characterful beers. If you've enjoyed the conversation that we've had, please go to beerandbrewing.com, click on the subscribe button. You can pull up our Android or iOS apps and read the Breakout Brewer story on Transient Artisan Ales. I don't know exactly which issue that was in. I'm going to have to look it up, but it is right there, and some photos of Chris and his operation. I know things have changed since then. I can't wait to see what it looks like now. I got to get up there sometime soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Chris, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, cheers.
Cheers.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com, or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.